The battlefield stretched across the horizon, a desolate wasteland scorched by years of conflict between humanity and the Valkyrian Empire. The air was thick with dust and the smell of scorched earth. Towering above the ground, the massive war machines of the Valkyrians moved like a slow, relentless tide, their engines rumbling like thunder. The Valkyrians, known for their technological superiority and brutal efficiency in warfare, had crushed every resistance they had encountered. Their previous victories against the human forces were swift and decisive, leaving behind shattered cities and defeated armies. General Uxar, the Valkyrian military commander, stood tall within the heavily fortified command center, overlooking the vast expanse through the reinforced windows. His forearms, a distinctive feature of his species, rested confidently behind his back as he watched the advancing troops. Their soldiers, bred and trained for combat from birth, marched in perfect synchronization. The general's sharp, insect-like eyes scanned the horizon. His mind, honed by years of military expertise, calculated every possible outcome. He had never faced a human force that could withstand the might of the Valkyrian military for long. Today would be no different, he thought. There was, however, one peculiarity. Despite the overwhelming force being deployed, there was only a single figure standing in the distance. The human wore a standard-issue exosuit, its dull gray surface barely discernible against the barren land. Tsar's soldiers were equipped with thermal and electromagnetic scanners, and yet they could find no additional human forces, no battalions hidden beneath the earth, no artillery stationed on the nearby ridges, just one lone soldier. General Exar's second-in-command, Captain Lox, let out a dismissive huff as he analyzed the readings on his datapad. "One soldier," he muttered, his voice layered with contempt. "One human dares to challenge an entire battalion. Their desperation knows no bounds." Tsar didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the solitary figure. Something about the situation seemed off. The humans had been driven to desperation before, but never had they sent a single soldier to face such overwhelming odds. It was an absurd tactic. No human, no matter how skilled or brave, could hold their ground against the technological might of the Valkyrian army. But the figure stood motionless, unflinching. "Send a reconnaissance drone," Tsar ordered, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of caution. He had learned long ago not to underestimate the resourcefulness of humanity. They were unpredictable, erratic even. It was what made them dangerous in their own way. A drone whirred into action, lifting off from one of the nearby platforms and speeding toward the human at blinding velocity. As the drone approached, it suddenly dropped out of the sky as if it had collided with an invisible wall. Its systems fried, the drone tumbled to the ground in a lifeless heap. The general's compound went silent. Lox blinked, perplexed. "It's offline. No sign of external interference. Could be a malfunction." Tsar frowned, his mandibles clicking together in thought. The Valkyrian drones didn't just malfunction. Not like this. He tapped his command panel, pulling up data from the drone before it had been disabled. The last image it had transmitted showed the human soldier looking up, directly at the drone, as if expecting it. Before he could issue his next command, more chaos unfolded. A series of explosions ripped through the Valkyrians' advanced armored vehicles stationed at the rear of the formation. The blasts were surgical, precise, igniting their fuel tanks and ammunition storages, turning the once imposing war machines into twisted metal and flame. Soldiers scattered in confusion, shouting orders and scrambling to understand the source of the attack. Yet there were no visible attackers, no incoming missiles or enemy aircraft. The explosions had seemed to come from within their own ranks. "Impossible," Lox growled, slamming his fist onto the control panel. "How could they infiltrate our ranks without us detecting it?" Tsar remained calm, but his mind raced. This was no ordinary attack. He zoomed in on the lone human, who still stood motionless in the distance, apparently unfazed by the destruction behind Valkyrian lines. The general's instinct screamed at him that this was no coincidence. The soldier was a part of this somehow. "Bring me his data," Sar barked. "I want a full analysis of who he is, how he's equipped, and how they're doing this." Lox worked feverishly at the controls, and within seconds, the Valkyrian data system had pulled the human's profile from their extensive war database. The soldier's name, Captain Jackson Hayes, a decorated operative of the Human Defense Force, highly trained in guerrilla warfare, infiltration, and sabotage. Jackson Hayes had been a thorn in the Valkyrian side for years, though until now he had only been involved in small-scale resistance operations. "This doesn't make sense," Lox muttered. "He's good, but not this good. There's no way he could do this on his own." But Sar knew better. His gut told him this was no ordinary soldier. Hayes was a human who had been shaped by the brutal realities of war, someone who had learned to survive against insurmountable odds. Sar's suspicions deepened. "Commander," Ixar said in a low tone, "this is not a traditional battle. He's using tactics we haven't anticipated. He's outsmarting us, and we're reacting too slowly." As more vehicles exploded in fiery bursts, the entire Valkyrian battalion fell into chaos. Systems were going offline, communications were being jammed, and their elite soldiers were struggling to regain control of the situation. The once orderly, synchronized army was now a chaotic mass of soldiers shouting commands and panicking as their most advanced machinery was torn apart by seemingly invisible hands. Suddenly, the lights in the command center flickered. The building shook as another series of explosions rocked the ground beneath them. A heavy silence fell upon the room as XR's command team turned toward their leader, fear creeping into their expressions. "Sir," Locke stammered, "we've lost contact with the secondary control units. We're blind out there." XR's cold, calculating mind began to piece the puzzle together. Hayes wasn't fighting their army head-on. He was disabling them from the inside, taking out key systems, spreading chaos and confusion. This wasn't a battle of strength, it was a battle of wit, and right now they were losing. "Captain," Sar commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative, "send in the reserves. Tell them to flank from both sides and encircle that human. He can't be allowed to escape." Lox nodded, relaying the orders immediately. But even as the reinforcements moved into position, something strange happened. Their navigation systems began to malfunction, sending false readings and leading them in circles. The soldiers, unable to communicate with their commanders due to the jamming of all signals, were left wandering aimlessly across the battlefield. From his vantage point, Ixar could see the full extent of the chaos. His once mighty battalion was being systematically dismantled by a single human. A cold realization settled over him. This was no ordinary attack. Hayes had anticipated every move they would make and countered it before they even realized what was happening. "Sir." Lox's voice was panicked now. "We're being overrun. The enemy, he's everywhere and nowhere at once." Zar's fists clenched tightly behind his back as he stared at the figure of Hayes, still standing unmoved on the horizon. How was it possible? A single human soldier was tearing apart an army that had conquered entire star systems. But Zar had faced impossible odds before. He wasn't about to let one human defeat him. He would adapt. He would overcome. The Valkyrian Empire had not been brought to its knees by any other species, and it wouldn't be now. "Prepare the walkers," Sar ordered, his voice calm but resolute. "We will crush him with overwhelming force." But even as the massive Valkyrian walkers, the towering, heavily armored war machines that symbolized their empire's power, started to march forward, Ixar couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes had planned for this too. The battle had only just begun. The battlefield was in chaos. The once unstoppable Valkyrian army, known for its ruthless efficiency and technological dominance, now lay in disarray. Their towering war machines, icons of their power, burned in the distance, reduced to smoldering wreckage by an unseen enemy. Communications were down, and soldiers ran in panic, their once perfect formations shattered like glass. General Zar watched through the shattered windows of his command center, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the devastation unfolding before him. The hulking walkers, the pride of the Valkyrian Empire, had begun their march moments ago. These enormous, heavily armored vehicles were equipped with weapons powerful enough to raze entire cities to the ground. As they lumbered across the battlefield, their imposing silhouettes casting long shadows across the desert-like terrain, Zar felt a fleeting sense of control returning. They were his final card to play, his overwhelming force that would crush any resistance. But as the walkers moved forward, something unexpected happened. A sudden, blinding light erupted from the ground beneath the first walker, followed by a deafening explosion. The machine, standing several stories tall, shuddered violently before toppling over. Its colossal mass hit the ground with an earth-shaking crash, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring the view of the remaining walkers. When the dust settled, the once proud war machine lay crippled, its legs twisted and broken. Zar's eyes widened in disbelief. The Valkyrian walkers were virtually indestructible. What could have taken one down so quickly? Before he could issue new orders, another explosion rocked the ground, this time beneath the second walker. The same fate awaited it, as it too collapsed in a twisted heap of metal and flame. One by one, the mighty war machines fell, taken down by precision strikes that seemed to target their most vulnerable points. It was as if their enemy knew exactly where to hit, as if they had studied the walkers' schematics and found their weakest spots. Inside the command center, Captain Locke stared at the unfolding carnage in shock. This is impossible," he stammered. "Those walkers are equipped with the best shielding technology. They can withstand orbital strikes." Zar remained silent, his mandibles clenched in frustration. He knew there was no point in trying to rationalize what was happening. The human soldier they faced, Captain Jackson Hayes, had outsmarted them at every turn. This wasn't a conventional battle where brute force would prevail. Hayes was fighting with tactics they had never anticipated, exploiting their weaknesses in ways they couldn't have foreseen. The general's cold, calculating mind shifted gears. He had fought in countless battles, had led the Valkyrian Empire to victory across multiple star systems, but this situation was different. It required a different kind of strategy, one that didn't rely on overwhelming firepower. Hayes wasn't just trying to win a battle, he was systematically dismantling their entire military apparatus. And he was doing it alone. Locke interrupted Zar's thoughts, his voice barely a whisper. "We've lost the walkers, sir. We're out of options." Zar turned to his second in command, his expression hardening. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of command. "We are not out of options. The battle isn't over yet." But even as he spoke, Ixar knew that their situation was dire. The Valkyrian army was being outmaneuvered at every turn. Their advanced technology, their superior numbers, it all meant nothing in the face of an opponent who could predict their every move. Outside the command center, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The explosions had stopped, and the dust began to settle. What remained of the Valkyrian forces were scattered across the landscape, their morale shattered. Soldiers huddled together in small groups, looking to their commanders for guidance, but the commanders themselves were lost, unable to contact each other or coordinate their next steps. Zar knew he had to act quickly. If he didn't regain control soon, the entire army would collapse. He moved to the command console, his fingers flying over the controls. "Activate the emergency protocols," he ordered. "I want all remaining forces to converge on the central command unit. We'll regroup and mount a defense here." Locke hesitated for a moment, then followed his orders. The central command unit was the last secure location they had, equipped with enough firepower to hold off an enemy assault. If they could regroup there, they might still have a chance to turn the tide. But even as they initiated the emergency protocols, Zar couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes had already anticipated this move. The human had been one step ahead of them from the beginning, and Xar knew that any conventional strategy would likely fail. This wasn't a war of weapons anymore, it was a war of minds. "Sir," Locke said, his voice strained, "the troops are converging on the central unit as ordered, but we've lost contact with several divisions. Their signals just disappeared." Xar's mandibles clicked together in frustration. Hayes was picking off their forces one by one, cutting off their communications and isolating them. It was a classic guerrilla tactic, and it was working. "We need to lure him out," Xar said, his mind racing. "If we can't fight him on his terms, we'll force him to fight on ours." Locke looked at his commander, confused. "But how? He's too far ahead of us. We don't even know where he is." Xar's eyes narrowed as a plan began to form in his mind. "We may not know where he is, but we know what he wants. He's not just trying to defeat us, he's trying to take control of our forces. If we make him think he's won, we can draw him into a trap." Locke blinked in surprise. "You mean surrender?" "Not surrender," Xar corrected. "A feint. We'll give him the illusion of victory, make him overconfident. Then, when he shows himself, we'll strike." It was a risky plan, but it was the only one they had left. If they could lure Hayes into the open, they might have a chance to stop him. But even as Xar issued the orders, a deep unease settled over him. He had never been forced to use such tactics before. The Valkyrian Empire had always been the dominant force in every battle they fought. To resort to trickery and deception felt dishonorable. But this was no ordinary enemy. Hayes had proven time and time again that he was not bound by the traditional rules of warfare. The Valkyrian forces began to retreat toward the central command unit, leaving behind the smoldering wreckage of their once mighty army. From the outside, it looked like a full-scale retreat, a sign of their defeat. But inside the command center, Xar and his officers prepared for the next phase of their plan. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thick. The Valkyrian soldiers, now regrouped at the central unit, waited in silence, their weapons at the ready. Xar stood at the front of the command center, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of their enemy. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. It was Hayes. He moved with a calm, confident stride, as if he had all the time in the world. The Valkyrian soldiers tensed, their fingers hovering over their triggers, but Xar held up a hand to stop them. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Hayes stopped a few hundred meters from the command center, standing alone in the open field. He made no move to attack, no move to advance. He just stood there, as if daring them to make the first move. Xar's mandibles clicked together in frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Hayes should have been overconfident by now, should have taken the bait and attacked. But instead, he was waiting. He knew. Somehow he knew. Before Xar could issue his next command, the lights in the command center flickered once more. The consoles went dark, and the air filled with the sound of static. Xar's heart sank as he realized what had happened. Hayes had disabled their systems. Again. The human had anticipated their every move, and now he had them trapped. The Valkyrian forces, gathered in one location, were sitting ducks. Xar had played right into his hands. Outside, Hayes raised a small device in his hand and pressed a button. A series of explosions ripped through the central unit's defenses, taking out their last remaining power generators. The command center plunged into darkness, and the soldiers outside were thrown into confusion. In the chaos, Xar could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. Hayes was coming for them. Locke turned to Xar, his face pale with fear. "Sir, what do we do?" "He's coming for us." Xar's mind raced. He had one last option, one final card to play. It wasn't much, but it was all they had left. "Prepare the self-destruct sequence," Xar ordered, his voice cold and steady. "If we can't win this battle, we'll make sure he doesn't win either." Locke hesitated for a moment, then nodded and began inputting the commands. The self-destruct sequence would destroy the entire command unit, along with everyone inside it. It was a last resort, a final act of defiance. But just as the sequence was about to initiate, the doors to the command center burst open. Hayes stood in the doorway, his eyes calm and determined. He had done it. He had taken down an entire army, defeated a force that had conquered worlds, and now stood victorious. Zar stared at him, his body rigid with defiance. He would not give Hayes the satisfaction of seeing him break. "You may have won this battle, human," he said, his voice filled with cold contempt, "but you will never defeat the Valkyrian Empire." Hayes said nothing. He didn't need to. His victory spoke louder than words ever could. As the Valkyrian command center crumbled around them, Zar knew that this day would go down in history as the moment one human had brought an empire to its knees.